Howdy folks, hope you've all had a great weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. And before we kick off proceedings with this month's audiobook recommendation, courtesy of Audible, where you can start listening with a free 30-day Audible trial, get full access to thousands of all-you-can-listen audiobooks, original entertainment and podcasts, all included in the Audible Plus catalogue, just by visiting audible.com/jingles or simply text jingles to 500 500. This month's audiobook recommendation, with your free Audible monthly credit, is not the usual fact-heavy historical narrative type documentary that I normally recommend. There's nothing wrong with those things. Learning stuff is never a bad thing. But sometimes you just want to listen to something enjoyable. And that's what this month's recommendation is. This month I'm recommending We Are Legion, We Are Bob, the first book in the increasingly inaccurately entitled Bobbyverse trilogy, because they're now up to 4 books in the series. It's the story of Bob Johansson, who's just sold his software company for a small fortune and is looking forward to a life of leisure. And the first item on his to-do list, spending all of his money. So he signs up to have his head cryogenically preserved in case of death, and then immediately gets himself killed crossing the street. He wakes up 117 years later, discovers that he's been declared property of the state. His mind has been uploaded into a sentient space probe with the ability to replicate itself. And now Bob and his clones are on a mission to find homes for humanity and boldly go where no Bob has gone before. Alexa, play Audible.
Getting your selection from Audible. Resuming We Are Legion, We Are Bob.
I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Ishmael. Part 1. 1. Bob, version 1.0. So, you'll cut my head off? I raised an eyebrow at the sales critter. I was baiting him. I knew it. He knew it. I knew he knew it. He grinned at me, happy to go along with the routine as long as me and my wallet continued to pay attention. Mr. Johansson, it's Bob. Please, you're not talking to my father. The Cryo-Eterna sales rep, the name tag identified him as Kevin, nodded and gestured toward the big placard which displayed the cryonics process in ghoulish detail. I took a moment to note his Armani suit and $100 haircut. It appeared there was money in cryonics. Bob, there's no point in freezing the entire body. Remember, the idea is to wait for advancements in medicine to be able to cure whatever killed you. By the time they can resuscitate your corpse, they'll likely be able to grow you a whole new body. That would be easier, in fact, than trying to patch up the old one.
It may all sound a bit silly, and in places it very definitely is. That's kind of the whole point. This is a fun audiobook recommendation, but it can also be quite thought-provoking and serious as well. And there are now 4 books in the series, so if you like the first one, you know what to spend next month's free audio credit on. New members can try Audible free for 30 days. Just visit audible.com/jingles or text jingles to 500 500. Meanwhile, in other news, Germans, are you ready for this? I hope you're paying attention, because there's a brand new first-person shooter that German players and only German players can get their hands on. Are you ready, Germany? Here we go, drum roll. There's not actually a drum roll. Wolfenstein 3D is finally available for sale, legally, in Germany. What are you talking about, old man? Wolfenstein Youngblood came out 3 years ago. No, not Youngblood. New Colossus, 2017? Nope. Old Blood? Nope. New Order? Nope. Wolfenstein 2009? Nope. Enemy Territory? Nope. Return to Castle Wolfenstein? No, I mean the actual original Wolfenstein, although you could argue that Wolfenstein 3D was a 3D remake of the original Castle Wolfenstein from 1981, and you'd be correct. But I'm talking about Wolfenstein 3D, 1992's hit shareware game, is finally, 30 years after its release, legally available for sale in Germany. Although technically the game was actually unbanned because it was banned in Germany, because, you know, swastikas, Hitler, all that kind of thing. Technically, the game was unbanned in 2017, but the German age rating agency, for want of a better word, didn't actually get around to giving the game an age certificate until just now. So 16-year-old Germans can now gun down Mecha Hitler and hordes of very, very badly pixelated Nazis. And they can now do it legally for the first time ever. Although, if they're going to be playing the sequel, well, not sequel, the add-on pack / expansion, Spear of Destiny, they must be 18. So congratulations, Germany. Welcome to the 90s. I hope you like it here. Although I think the most surprising thing about this, I mean, well, obviously the game was banned for so long because it featured all this Nazi iconography, and you got to fight Mecha Hitler, and so Germany has very strict laws about that sort of thing for what should be very obvious reasons. But the most surprising thing about all of this is the price. How much is it, and where can we buy it, I hear you all ask. Although, probably sounds more like, how much is it, and where can we... You know what, I've got too much of a cold to do a German accent right now. But you can get it on Good Old Games and the Microsoft Store for €5, which seems a little overpriced for a 30-year-old piece of shareware, but hey, you know, whatever. I guess they're trading on the nostalgia value. Anyway, congratulations, Germany, and welcome to 1992. Most of you probably weren't even born back then, or at the very least weren't old enough to remember 1992. If that's the case, let me put this into perspective for you. This is a game that came out a mere 2 years after Germany was still divided into East and West and wouldn't be reunited until mediocre 90s TV actor David Hasselhoff sang a really, really bad song on top of the Berlin Wall, catapulting him to, well, not international, but at least German stardom, and selling millions of his CDs overnight. Starting a good 30 years of David Hasselhoff is famous in Germany for some reason memes, and selling countless t-shirts taking the piss out of this fact. And I think Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of the Soviet Union, had something to do with it as well. Anyway, so back to World of Warships, I guess, because after last week's episode, when I was heaping praise upon Wargaming, and it was praise that was well-deserved in my opinion for bringing back and revamping the Operations game mode. But, well, this is Wargaming, so that was the step forward. Where are the 2 steps back? And it didn't take long. So anyway, a bit of context first. First, we really need to talk about the railgun bug. That's right, another entirely different bug. And the way this worked, and it can be a little tricky to understand, but apparently the way this bug worked was that when you're aiming at a target in World of Warships, the instant you press the fire button, the game does a bunch of calculations. Let's say that you're in, I don't know, let's say the American Tier 10 cruiser, the Des Moines, and you're locked onto a target 15 kilometers away, aiming at and shooting at a target that's 15 kilometers away. As soon as you press the fire button, the game says, okay, the target's 15 kilometers away, your shells have this much velocity, this much penetration at that range, and that's what happens when those shells reach the target if they hit. But what people had found out they could do was that if you aim below the target, so not 15 kilometers away, but instead 4 kilometers away, and then as you press the fire button, you, as quickly as you possibly can, mouse up so that the crosshairs are now over the target, the game doesn't have the time to realise that when you pressed fire, you're actually aiming at a target 15 kilometers away. So it applies the penetration value that your shells would have fired at a target 4 kilometers away, which is where you were actually aiming when you pressed the fire button and quickly moused up onto the target that you were actually shooting at. So when those shells arrive at the target, instead of losing velocity because they've had to travel 15 kilometers to get there, and having lower penetration values and just shattering off your target's armoured belt, they have the penetration values that the game calculated they would have at a range of 4 kilometers when they basically hadn't lost any velocity whatsoever, and so they would punch right through the armoured belt of the target and probably citadel them from 15 kilometers. But that was only part of the problem. I mean, that is bad enough. But, well, there were funny things happening with shell velocity as well. Now, shell velocity is an important part of the penetration value of armor-piercing shells fired in World of Warships, and most ships have guns that fire shells with a velocity of anything between 750 to, say, 850 meters per second. But another thing that was happening with this railgun bug, and why it was called the railgun bug, is that, well, and again, going back to our previous example, you're aiming at a target that's 15 kilometers away, or you're going to shoot at a target that's 15 kilometers away, but you're actually aiming below the target, maybe, say, 4 kilometers away, so that when you exploit this bug, you press fire and mouse up very quickly onto the actual target at a range of 15 kilometers. The game thinks you're shooting at something 4 kilometers away and applies the penetration value that your shells would have at 4 kilometers to a target that you're actually hitting 15 kilometers away. But it doesn't just apply the shell penetration values. The game's expecting your shells to arrive at a target that's only 4 kilometers away, and which it should be able to cover in maybe 2 or 3 seconds. Except the shells are actually being delivered to a target that's 15 kilometers away, and which, depending on the shells that you're firing, you know, the weight and the initial muzzle velocity, might take 5, 6, 7 seconds to get there. But they were taking the same time to get there as they would have if they'd been fired at the target at the initial aim point of 4 kilometers away, massively boosting the shell velocity to multiple kilometers per second instead of the 750 to 850, or if you had a ship with very, very high muzzle velocity, 1 kilometer per second. In fact, if you practiced at it and you got very, very good at exploiting this railgun bug, you could have your shells crossing the map at, well, I don't know, 25 kilometers per second, or basically instantaneously, giving your target, oh, I don't know, 0.1 seconds to angle or dodge. Now, admittedly, this was a very, very difficult bug to exploit. Most people weren't able to do it, but some people were, and they became unstoppable. So, naturally, Wargaming leapt into action in order to code a fix for this, probably because people were using it to snipe carriers from across the map, and we all know we can't have people doing that. So, how do you think Wargaming fixed this problem? Do you think they sat down, looked through the source code, analysed the issue, discovered the exact line of code that was causing the problem, and coded a fix to remove the base issue from the game? Or do you think they just slapped the laziest, most half-assed band-aid on the problem, crossed their fingers and hoped that that was going to work? Yeah, it wasn't the first of the two options, although apparently, you know, there's a certain amount of sympathy here for Wargaming, because the game engine that they're using, we've had problems in the past with exploits cropping up and bugs creeping into the game as a result of the game's polling rate, how many times per second the game checks what it is that you're actually doing. I don't know if you remember a couple of months back, actually quite a few months back now, I was talking about a bug that had crept in that only really affected people that had ships that fired really, really fast. So some of the newer destroyers, like the Forrest Sherman, for example. So when you spent some captain points on a skill that would further reduce the reload of your guns, it was basically a wasted captain point. Or in some cases, 4 wasted captain points, because it would actually slow down the rate your guns were firing, because the guns were just firing too fast for the game to keep up. Because, of course, you know, back when the game was released, guns that fire every 1.5 seconds, that's never going to happen. I mean, this wasn't a bug. This was a limitation of the game engine that they knew they had when they originally developed the game. They just never anticipated putting ships in that would fire fast enough to be affected by the low polling rate of the game engine. And then they introduced ships. I mean, it was entirely a problem of their own making. They knew this problem was going to be there somewhere down the line if they ever introduced ships that fired fast enough to fall victim to this issue. So when they did introduce ships that fired fast enough to fall victim to this issue, oh look, what a surprise. Wow, who saw that one coming? You did, 7 years ago, when you were coding the base game. I mean, yeah, whatever, anyway. And this railgun bug that they're having to fix basically takes advantage of that same sort of thing as well, because the game doesn't have time to calculate the difference between, if you're good and you can pull it off, and not many people could, but the game wouldn't have time to calculate the difference between where you were aiming and what you're actually shooting at. And that's how the railgun bug worked. But it must be emphasized that it's very, very tricky to pull off. The tiniest percentage of the player base actually managed to master this. Most people would just miss horribly because they wouldn't be able to time it right. But it did need fixing because certain people could pull it off and were becoming unstoppable. So, not going to be an easy thing to fix. This is an underlying problem with the game engine. But the fix that they have implemented, and again I must stress, the actual problem, like the tiniest fraction of 1% of the player base were taking advantage of it. That doesn't mean that it didn't need to be addressed. It just meant that it was actually a tiny problem that was kind of being blown out of proportion by the YouTube videos covering it. But the fix that they've implemented screws up everybody. And this can't even be called a new bug because it's working exactly as intended. If you want to see this bug in action, I'll put a link in the description to Flamu's video on the subject. Yeah, I know many of you are thinking, no, Flamu bad. Yep, fine, okay, I get it, whatever. Just watch the first 2 minutes of his video. That demonstrates this new feature perfectly. But what's basically happening now is you see a target, you aim at it, you press fire as soon as the cursor's over the target. And your shells land 12 kilometers short, because now they're actually being fired at where they were half a second before you pressed the fire button. And a lot of people recently have been asking the question, what the hell is going on with my shell accuracy? That is not where I aimed. That's not even close to where I aimed. What's going on with my guns? It's this. It's the fix to the railgun bug. Now, let me give you a for example that isn't completely out of the question. It may not happen in every battle, but it's going to happen fairly often. Let's say you're coming around the corner of an island in a cruiser or a battleship or whatever, and suddenly a wild destroyer appears at point-blank range, but he's on very, very low health, and you know he's swinging his torpedo tubes around, and you've got to get him before he gets those torpedoes away, or you are dead. So you swing the guns around and you fire at the target, and your shells whiff harmlessly 3 kilometers to the left of where you actually fired them, because that's where the guns were pointing half a second ago, because that's the amount of artificial lag that the game now puts into where your guns are firing versus where the guns were actually aimed at, in order to fix a bug that was affecting, I don't know, maybe 0.02% of the player base. Yeah. Wargaming. Fixing bugs with sledgehammers rather than scalpels since, I don't know, how long is it now? 7 years? Since 2015. So now the upshot of all of this is basically that now in World of Warships, and maybe this doesn't apply so much to battleships, but certainly if you're playing destroyers and some of the light cruisers, it is actually a relatively fast-paced third-person shooter. But now, in order to have your shells landing in roughly the same postcode as where you were actually aiming them, there's half a second of aiming lag. And this isn't even a bug. I mean, a bug is an unintended consequence of a change to the game code. This, a half second of aiming lag in what can be a relatively fast-paced third-person shooter, is Wargaming's idea of working as intended. Yeah, I don't think I really need to say any more about that. All of which brings us to the end of this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've at least been amused by it. I hope you all had a great weekend, but you can forget it now because it's back to work. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.